Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's very exciting Free Library of Philadelphia Foundation author event. It is wonderful to see you all here. We have an extraordinary fall season, complete with historians and artists and novelists and politicians. Tonight, we wrap up our events for the month of September, during which we welcomed the best-selling author Ken Follett, Harvard professor Jill Lepore, and Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, among many others. We'll be keeping it going in October and November, and we sincerely hope that you will join us for more events. Tickets are selling fast, so please do register at our webpage, freelibraryfoundation.org. I want to say just a few words about our organization in general. The foundation works together with the Free Library to support programming and advance its mission of promoting literacy throughout the Philadelphia region. But as a nonprofit, we are, of course, reliant upon your support to help us achieve these goals, so please do consider donating, which you can also do through our website. Again, that's freelibraryfoundation.org. Before we get to tonight's program, there are a few people and organizations I would like to thank. I'd like to thank Uncle Bobby's, our partner bookseller, and the Philadelphia Citizen, our media partner. And finally, I'd like to thank the volunteers, a dedicated group of library patrons who help us keep this program running. You would have seen a couple of them outside the auditorium as you came in this evening. We are so grateful for their support. Tonight, we welcome Nicholas Boggs, who is the recipient of a 2023 Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant and fellowships from the Leon Levy Center for Biography, the Scholars in Residence program at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the Gilder Lerman Center and Beinecke Library at Yale, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as residencies at Yaddo and MacDowell. Most recently, he was the 2024-25 John Hope Franklin Fellow at the National Humanities Center. Tonight, he will be speaking with us about his best-selling new book, Baldwin, A Love Story, the first major biography of James Baldwin in over 3 decades. Boggs offers a bold, compassionate portrait that challenges traditional biography and that brings overlooked, even excluded aspects of Baldwin's life into sharp focus. Zadie Smith's assessment captures this perfectly. She writes, quote, "We have been presented with many partial Baldwins over the years, but here is the whole lovable man, the radical and the celebrity, the civil rights hero and the downright playwright, the cosmopolitan jet-setter, and the son of East Harlem." Boggs will be joined in conversation by Rachel L. Swarns, who is a journalist, author, and associate professor of journalism at New York University, who writes about race and history as a contributing writer for the New York Times. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the Society of American Historians, and her work has been recognized and supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Ford Foundation, the Leon Levy Center for Biography, the Biographers International Organization, and others. Her latest book, The 272, The Families Who Were Enslaved and Sold to Build the American Catholic Church, was published by Random House. This promises to be an incredible conversation. Please join me in welcoming Nicholas Boggs and Rachel Swarns.
Hey, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Well, this is such a pleasure for me in so many ways. I have to tell you that I finished this book about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and when I put it down on my kitchen table, I just wept. I still feel that wave of emotion, even now. And so it really is a privilege. It's a privilege because it's an extraordinary book in its depth, complexity, and power, but also because I've had the great privilege of watching this work unfold in real time. So Nick and I first met 20 years ago. Is it that long? No. In 2020, during the pandemic, when we were both at NYU and we were both fellows with the New York NYU Center for the Humanities, working on our respective books. And it has been so cool to just watch this gestate, as Baldwin might have said, and to see it burst into the world in this way. One of the things that will strike you from the very beginning is that this is not a book that feels like an outsider, someone from the 21st century just picked up a pen and is writing about this person. It feels like you are being shepherded by someone who has known Baldwin for a very long time. And that is because that is indeed the case. It has been how many years?
20, 30, 40.
A lifetime of years. And so it's a great way to start the conversation. I was thinking I'd like you to do the origin story. But let's first listen to a short clip where Nick describes Baldwin's origin story.
James Baldwin was just 10 or 11 years old when he sat down in a darkened movie theater to watch 20,000 Years in Sing Sing, starring a screen siren who was about to become a source of unlikely salvation. As he would go on to tell it one day, "So here, now, was Betty Davis on a Saturday afternoon in close-up over a champagne glass, Popeyes popping." He was transfixed by her eyes, which looked just like his mother's, a shocking recognition that would allow him to understand, albeit years later, why the man he called his father, who unbeknownst to him at the time was actually his stepfather, was always at pains to remind him that the large, heavy-lidded eyes he had inherited from her made him the ugliest boy he's ever seen. For it was not his hatred of my frog eyes which hurt me, he would come to realize, but the fact that he was not attacking me so much as he was attacking my mother, and also by extension, then, my real and unknown father. But what he did see in this moment, clear as the daylight beyond the movie theater's walls, was that he had caught his embittered father not so much in a lie as in an infirmity. For he must have been stricken blind if he was unable to see that my mother was absolutely, beyond any question, the most beautiful woman in the world. This was a lesson in self-love that would be tested time and time again as he moved through the trials and tribulations of his adolescent years, and indeed throughout the entirety of his life. It was also a lesson about kinship, by blood, and beyond it.
So you introduce us here to Baldwin as an adolescent, and tell us you were young yourself when you first met James Baldwin.
Well, that was the voice of Ron Butler in the audio book, and it's fantastic, so I highly recommend it. He breaks into Baldwin's voice, as you can hear at times when I quote from him. Thanks, everybody, for coming tonight. I'm really pleased to be here. Baldwin has a history with Philadelphia that I can go into later that's a little bit amusing. But also, Rachel, thank you. Rachel and I were really partners in writing these books at exactly the same time, and it's just so wonderful to speak with you today. So, my origin story, everybody has an origin story with Baldwin. We could probably go around this room and everybody would have one. Mine began, the reason I like that opening in terms of my own story is that it was his eyes that I saw first. I was in the 8th grade in a DC public schools classroom, 8th grade English classroom, and my teacher had put drawings of famous black authors on the cracked walls throughout the classroom, and there was Baldwin with these huge, enormous eyes staring back at me. So that's what I remember most, although I recently spoke to my English teacher, and she told me that I actually came into my 8th grade class, I'd forgotten this, in a suit and gave a presentation on Baldwin's life in the 8th grade. I repressed that, much like I've repressed the process of writing this book, but we'll still try to talk about it.
So, first biography in 30 years, what was it that made you think that, it was time for something else?
It's very hard to describe because I didn't think that this biography, when I got the book contract, I'd never read a biography from start to finish, even David Leeming's astonishing 1994 Baldwin biography, like many Baldwin scholars, and I see some in the audience tonight. I would go into the index and look things up, so I sort of probably read the whole thing, but piecemeal. This came out in 1994. So I sort of backed into it chronologically. I discovered this out-of-print children's book by Baldwin when I was in college at the Beinecke. This was 1996, and I sent an email to David Leeming, the second email of my life, asking if he had any information about the painter who illustrated the book, Yoran Cazac. And he told me that he was dead, he believed, and that he'd never met him. And then 7 years later, I sent a bunch of emails to art historians in Paris from New York City saying, do you know anything about this obscure French painter, Yoran Cazac? And I left my phone number, and a few weeks later, I got a phone call, and it's this raspy French accented voice. This man says, I'm Yoran Cazac, I'm alive, I'm in Paris, come over and interview me, and I did. And he died, unfortunately, 2 years later, but I spent, with my co-editor, Jennifer DeVere Brody, I spent about 10 years trying to get the book republished, and it finally did in 2018 with Duke University Press. But in the process, I discovered this kind of last great love story of Baldwin's with this married man who he dedicated the novel If Beale Street Could Talk to. And I thought I was just going to be writing about that, but slowly I started to realize that he connected to other gaps, major gaps in Baldwin's life, particularly these figures that he had love relationships with, whether they were sort of platonic, as it was with his spiritual father, Beauford Delaney, or romantic or erotic, as was with Yoran Cazac, Lucien Happersberger, who he dedicated Giovanni's Room to, other figures. And I figured out that really looking through the prism of love, we could understand not just Baldwin's life, but also a lot of his writing. His novels are love stories, and his political writings, like The Fire Next Time, are all about kind of love.
Right. And what a journey that was, right? Because you discovered that manuscript when you were...
A junior in college.
So it's been a life's work. And it is a love story, and you really explore love in all of its manifestations. And I want to talk about all of it. We only have so much time, but I'm going to get to as much of it as I can. But I'm hoping you can talk to us a bit first about his life as a gay man, and which until now has not been fully explored. He was obviously a pioneer, a literary pioneer in this regard. And I only read Giovanni's Room maybe like 7 or 8 years ago, but a finalist for the National Book Award. But tell us about that.
You're setting me up there because he didn't think of himself as gay. That was a word that he actually rejected. But he also rejected kind of all labels. He rejected black and white, even male and female later in his career. He was talking about how we're all androgynous.
Yeah.
He's talked about homosexuality as a verb, not a noun.
Yeah.
It wasn't that he was in any kind of closet. It's that this was a different time, but also, he really didn't want to be pigeonholed in these ways. He saw these definitions as part of systems of domination, right? And instead of kind of kowtowing to that, he wanted to come up with his own self-definition. But he wrote Giovanni's Room, which you mentioned, in part, as he put it, so nobody could blackmail him. He said, "You didn't tell me, I told you," right? So he was, his major erotic and love attachments in that sense were to other men, but he also had very strong bonds with women, and that's another thing that I explore in the book. Even though it's structured through these 4 major love affairs with men, he was extremely close to Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, Lorraine Hansberry, a woman named Mary Painter who he wrote these extraordinary letters to when he was in Paris. So it's important to remember that he rejected these categories, and he also embraced people of all kinds of different genders, races, nationalities, cultures.
Right. As you said, and as I mentioned, love's in all of its forms. Do you think, though, that he's obviously rejecting labels? That's one way of looking at it. Do you think he internalized any of kind of the stereotypes that were swirling around him at the time, as many of us do, about race, gender, ethnicity?
Not at all. No.
Okay.
No, I'm kidding. Of course he did. Yes.
Yes. I was going to say, really?
I mean, that's sort of what that opening clip tells us, right? His journey to self-love was incredibly difficult and hard won, and it's part of why he had such insights, right, into race relations in America and the kind of difficult love that he also had for his country. But yeah, he grew up being called a sissy, being called frog eyes by his father, being called ugly. So he had to kind of, that's why when he saw Betty Davis's eyes in that moment, it's such a complicated moment, because he's been told that he's ugly because of his eyes, which look like his mother's eyes. And then he's like, well, wait a second, Betty Davis is beautiful and powerful, and his eyes became kind of a source of power, and also a way that he could witness the world, as he called himself a witness. That was his self-description. So I think, yes, he internalized them, as we all do, but he did this extraordinary thing. Kind of, an interviewer asked him once, you grew up black, poor, and gay, like, how was that? And he said, I hit the jackpot. Because he was able to, he had this not unique perspective, but this special perspective on culture, on America in particular. But he didn't just have that. He also had this gift and facility with language, so he knew what to do with this perspective. That part's important too.
You break it up into sections, and you talk about some of the people who were really important to him. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about some of these relationships, which were complicated, some platonic, some romantic, but all of them really fueled his art.
Sure. So the first one, book one, is about Beauford Delaney, the incredible Black American painter who's now thankfully being seen for the great artist that he was. But Baldwin met him when he was just 16, and Beauford was 37, and he was kind of a downtown personality living in Greenwich Village. Baldwin was working at a sweatshop after school. He grew up in Harlem. And a friend had told him that there was this kind of kooky older artist. To them, that 37 seemed ancient. That's how Baldwin put it. So Baldwin went over to his house, went over to his studio, and he became his spiritual father eventually. But he introduced him to blues and jazz, which he wasn't allowed to listen to in his house. He took him backstage to meet Marian Anderson. He taught him, Baldwin said, that a black man could be an artist for the first time. So there's a famous story that many people know, but they were walking down the streets of Broadway, and he says, look down, and it was a gutter. What do you see? Baldwin said, a gutter. He said, look again. And he saw how the buildings around them were being reflected in the dirty water into something beautiful. So he taught him how to see the world as an artist, and this is something that stayed with him. However, he also painted a nude portrait of him. So it was this complicated relationship called dark rapture. And Beauford, I went at the Beinecke Library. There was incredible interviews that David Leeming had done with Baldwin in almost his last year of life, where he finally asked him, was Beauford in love with you? What was the status of that relationship? Because it was lifelong and complicated. And Baldwin said, yes, he wanted something physical, but he knew I wasn't interested, and he kind of saved my life by not pushing that, and instead kind of accepting this kind of paternal role. And then he followed him to France. Beauford followed Baldwin there. And over the years, Baldwin kind of became his protector. Like the roles switched, and Beauford died in 1979, 8 years before Baldwin.
And the two others?
Oh gosh, okay, I'll do those quickly.
Yep, we're gonna do, yep.
The second one is Lucien Happersberger, who he dedicated Giovanni's Room to. They met when Baldwin moved to Paris. Lucien was just 17. And Baldwin was trying to finish his first novel, didn't have a title for it, couldn't finish it. And Lucien pretended to have tuberculosis, so his father would lend them this chalet in the Swiss Alps and give them some money. And Baldwin, they went there 3 times over the course of about a year and a half. The first time, Baldwin was very ill, and Lucien nurtured him, took care of him. And then they went on a hike, and he came up with the title Go Tell on the Mountain. They came back, he brought Bessie Smith records and discovered The Voice. They went back again, and Baldwin finished it. So that created this kind of template of sort of intimacy and creativity that Baldwin tried to reproduce in other relationships as well. So Baldwin and Lucien were romantically linked throughout Baldwin's life, but it was a rocky relationship. Lucien got married, had kids. Baldwin was the godfather to one of them. Very complicated. He later became Baldwin's business manager, and they became involved again. But he was also at Baldwin's side when he died. The third figure in the book is Engin Cezzar, a beautiful Turkish actor who Baldwin met in Greenwich Village in the 50s, who actually played the character Giovanni in an actor's studio rendition of the play in Greenwich Village. Baldwin later followed him to Istanbul in 1961, where he took care of him, and Baldwin was able to finish another country. Are you guys sensing a pattern here? Okay.
There is that pattern.
And then the third one is Yoran Cazac, who I went and tracked down, and he was Baldwin's. Turns out they were lovers in the 70s, and he helped Baldwin write If Beale Street Could Talk, and also they broke up, but he really impacted the writing of Just Above My Head, Baldwin's final novel.
Right, and there is this pattern here. He talks so much about the love, the kind of that he's seeking, but at times seems like he's pursuing love interests that almost certainly it's not going to work, and they were much younger, or they preferred women and were married. At the same time, it was so generative, right, for his work. How do you see that?
I see it exactly the way you described it. I mean, I think Baldwin's first love was art, was his writing. And I think these were structures of relation that inspired him. And this sort of push and pull, this yearning. I mean, look at the plot of his novels. But I also think there can be a tendency with Baldwin to kind of paint his life in tragic terms. And one of the things I wanted to emphasize in this book was that he had a lot of love and he had a lot of community, and these were sustaining relationships. They may not look like a conventional marriage, but in fact, Beauford was, they were in a kinship relationship for Baldwin's entire life. Lucien, the same thing. Engin, pretty much the same as well. So Baldwin was living such an unusual transatlantic life. He called himself a transatlantic commuter, that I think this structure was sort of inevitable for what his life's calling and mission was.
So we've been talking a bit about romantic love, but you explore all kinds of love and platonic love. I wanted to talk about some of the women and his family too. Mary Painter, Engin's wife, for instance, too. But I was really hoping you could talk a little bit about his siblings, because he has, as we all heard, this really difficult, traumatic relationship with his stepfather, and has this kind of rupture a bit with his family. But his family life with his mother and his siblings, David and Gloria, ended up being such a balm in his life.
They were. I mean, it was complicated. He was the eldest of 9 children, so he kind of grew up raising these children. He became a parent in a sense when he was way too young to be a parent.
His father dies, and his youngest sister is born.
Yeah, the same
day.
That's right. But he was very close to his siblings. His brother David, in particular, who followed him eventually to Europe and came back and forth and was kind of his protector in some ways. His sister Paula came over one summer, and she was supposed to stay for longer, but she was very young, got a little bit overwhelmed by Paris. But he was very close to his family. He took them all to Puerto Rico for a trip one year, along with Lucien. But one of the things that powered his ambition was to care for his family. He didn't want his mother to be cleaning homes anymore. He wanted to buy them a house, which he did.
Which he does,
on West 71st Street. And they were a source of solace, but also responsibility. It was a heavy responsibility to have. He felt very, very guilty about going to Paris when he was 24 and leaving them behind because he felt so responsible. He felt ashamed, but he said, I have to go, become a famous writer, and then I'll be back. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. One of the things that is really great about this book, of the many things, is that you don't fall victim to the biographer's curse, tending to kiss away his failings, his shortcomings. On the lighter side, you observe that he kind of assumed some Britishisms in his speech, right, when he was doing interviews. We hear from Lucien, who starts to complain that he likes maybe to hear his voice a little too much in a room. On a deeper level, though, he talks so much about the importance, the primacy of human connection across race and gender, and he lives that. At the same time as he fails some of the people he loved in such heartbreaking ways. And I'm thinking there about Mary Painter and the cavalier way in which he deals with the time that he finds out that she was a victim of sexual assault. And I'm thinking about Beauford Delaney, which we've all heard was such an important figure for him. But in the last years of Beauford Delaney's life, when he was struggling, infirm, etc., Baldwin is distant. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, with Mary Painter, that was probably the part in the book where I stepped in more than elsewhere to kind of mark this odd contradiction in a way that was, I think, part of the times, but also part of their relationship. Baldwin wrote her these extraordinary letters about his creative process, about his love life, and she really was, I call it a kind of epistolary persona, because he's almost like trying out his writing techniques and ideas, and we don't have access to her letters. They're actually sealed at the Schomburg for another 12 or 13 years. So I had to sort of speculate a little bit, but when she was sexually assaulted by a mutual friend, he sort of was concerned for a little while, but pretty quickly turned back to writing the letter about his creative process.
Right.
So, we can't know the full story until we have access to the rest of those letters. But it's worth noting, one thing that I explore that's interesting in Baldwin's life is he was so close to so many women. And yet his relationship to feminism and black feminism was a complicated one, but also an evolving one. We have a brilliant scholar here tonight, Dagmawi Wubshet, who has talked and written about this in ways that I found extremely helpful. Because that's the question that we're still grappling with. This relationship with Audre Lorde and Nikki Giovanni, these were troubling conversations, and yet I do believe, and Dagmawi can correct me or chime in, but I do believe that he was evolving because of them. I think we see that in his later works. We see that in how he was championing black women writers like Gail Jones in the 70s and the 80s, and we see the impact of Toni Morrison in particular on his writing. He wrote If Beale Street Could Talk from the first-person perspective of a black woman for the first time, and it's such an interesting voice because on the one hand, it sounds very much like such a woman might sound, and Toni Morrison told him that. On the other hand, it sounds a lot like James Baldwin.
It in fact does, yes.
Being angry that Yoran Cazac is not his exclusive partner. So with Baldwin, there are always these multiple layers that are happening. I do want to say that Baldwin saw Lorraine Hansberry's play, Raisin in the Sun, in previews for the first time here in Philadelphia. And it was Sidney Poitier who gave him his house seats. So Baldwin was down here being an assistant to Elia Kazan, and he absolutely loved being present for that kind of life-changing play.
And Beauford Delaney, in his last years, what happened there?
Well, I mean, Beauford, you have to read the book, but they had such a complicated relationship because it was like a father-son relationship. How many of us have complicated relationships with our parents, right? So you have to kind of see it, I think, a little bit through that lens. You also have to see it through the lens of what Baldwin was going through in the 70s in his own life, okay? The failures of the civil rights movement, okay? The FBI tracking him everywhere he goes. Yoran Cazac sort of leaving him. And the critical establishment in the US, white liberals and black intellectuals and sort of politicians as well, were saying that he was a has-been. So this was a rough moment for him, and he had tried to kill himself a couple times as well. So I think having compassion for Baldwin's, the predicaments that he was in, he did take care of Beauford. He was not able to attend his funeral because I think his funerals were so loaded for him after his stepfather's complicated funeral, and his never having met his own father. I think it was too much for Baldwin to bear. But he did take care of Beauford a lot financially and in other ways throughout his life, and particularly the later years.
That's a good segue into my next question, which is I thought I see so many nicks in this book. The meticulous researcher, which we're going to get to, the powerful writer, which you'll hear. But there's a Nick that I did not know, I know of, but it's Nick the literary scholar and the critic. And it's so well woven into this. But I thought that you are doing two things here, and this ties into what you were saying a bit before. You're telling the story of a life, but it seems to me that you're also pressing for a critical reevaluation of some of his later work, which, as you point out, was not acclaimed, which was panned. And it sounds like you feel like it has a place in the canon that has not been sufficiently recognized. I wonder if you can talk about that.
Well, I think it within the universities, it has been. I mean, there's been an effort by Eddie Glaude and Ed Pavlik and Dagmawi and others to kind of recuperate this later work, and I think bringing Little Man back into print is sort of part of this broader effort. But there still is this narrative out there. Louis Manand even reproduced it in The New Yorker in his recent article that Baldwin was a much better essayist than novelist, and that his later work was kind of a failure. So there's been a reassessment that's been going on in scholarly circles for quite some time. But I wanted this biography to kind of present that information, even as it's funny that you said as a literary scholar, because I felt like I spent this book trying to get away from literary scholarship and really trying to focus on storytelling. Thank you, but
it was so well done. It was so well done. I think about the span of his life and what he witnessed and lived through, and how much time he actually spent away from America, and that push and pull that he felt about his relationship with the United States. And I think we can understand that a bit if we listen to this clip from Nick's book, which is just a little bit longer than the earlier one.
This is about 3 to 4 minutes, so settle in.
Yeah.
It's when Baldwin is out in Hollywood trying to write the screenplay for Malcolm X.
Later, April 4th, 1968, was a day in Palm Springs I will remember forever, Baldwin wrote. Billy D. Williams had come to town, he continued, and I felt confident that day. I was never to feel so confident again. He spoke openly to a reporter who had come by to lay my cards on the table, as he put it, and to state as clearly as I could what I felt the movie was about and how I intended to handle it. Baldwin was determined to cast the part of Malcolm himself, and while Columbia wanted James Earl Jones or Sidney Poitier, or even Charlton Heston, of all people, basically in blackface, he wanted Williams to play the role. In fact, Baldwin had fallen for Williams romantically when they had met a couple of years earlier, and his crush was deepening now that they were staying together in Palm Springs, where a staff that included a cook and a driver were catering to their every need. With Williams on the other side of the pool, doing what I took to be African improvisations to the sound of Aretha Franklin, Baldwin wrote, one of these staff members had brought the phone out to the pool, and when it rang, Baldwin picked up. It was an actor friend named David Moses, but his voice sounded odd. "Jimmy," he said, "Martin's been shot. He's not dead yet, but it's a head wound, so." Baldwin would later write that what happened next was a blur, except for the fact that they must have turned on the television set, and how he was weeping briefly, more in hopeless rage than in sorrow, with Billy trying to comfort me. The blur would continue through to King's funeral 5 days later. I went to Atlanta alone, Baldwin wrote. I don't remember why, but the details he did recall are revealing. How he wore the same dark suit he had recently bought to wear to the Du Bois event alongside King at Carnegie Hall. How he'd had to push his way into the packed church where he saw Harry Belafonte seated next to Coretta Scott King, and then in the pew in front of him, there sat Marlon Brando, Sammy Davis, Eartha Kitt, covered in black, looking like a lost 10-year-old girl, and Sidney Poitier. As the surface washed over him, in waves, he would write, he did his best not to cry, for tears seemed futile. And I may also have been afraid, and I could not have been the only one, that if I began to weep, I would not be able to stop.
So I just did an event in Los Angeles, and David Moses, the man who called Baldwin to tell him that King had been shot, was there in the audience.
Oh my.
And I mentioned that to underscore something that I think is really important, which is that this wasn't that long ago. You know, there's a way that sometimes people can think of the 60s as, you know, the distant past. And it was one of the reasons that I fought really hard for my publisher to have color photographs in the insert, because if they're black and white, it gives this sense that it's ancient history. And of course, the kinds of political violence that we are experiencing now are all too reminiscent of that time period. So it was quite something to sort of see David Moses out there in the audience and speak with him afterwards.
Talk a little bit about that push and pull he felt about the United States. It seemed that he talked about having to leave to save his life as a writer, as an artist. It seemed like he often felt more at home, or that he could be more of himself outside of the United States. Is that right?
For sure. I mean, after this terrible experience in Hollywood, the Charlton Heston situation, he attempted suicide again, and then he ended up eventually going to Istanbul and spending a great deal of time there directing a play. He gave up on the Malcolm X screenplay because it just wasn't going well. But this was a pattern that throughout his life, as you say, he left the United States first because his best friend Eugene Worth had sort of jumped to his suicide from the George Washington Bridge. And Baldwin really felt that he was next. And even when he would come back to New York, he hated being there. I mean, the FBI was following him. But, you know, Medgar Evers is killed, Malcolm X is killed, Martin Luther King is killed. It was very reasonable for him to think that he, and his family, as they did, to think that he was next. So it was a question of safety, but also a creative possibility. He could not write from the States, but he also felt, as he said it, you know, it's from another place, and he was talking about Istanbul, that you can see America more clearly, because when you're in America, you have nothing to compare it to. Those are his words. It was in that Swiss village that he wrote Giovanni's Room, but he also wrote his important essay, Stranger in the Village, about being the only black person for miles, and how that gave him this perspective, not just on Switzerland, but on sort of whiteness and Western civilization. So absolutely, he found it to be essential to be abroad, and he wrote to Engin Cezzar this beautiful letter from the artist residency in MacDowell, and he said, someday I want to build a house by the side of the mountain or the edge of the sea where I can be, free, basically. And he ended up doing that. He had a house just like that in the south of France for the last 18 or so years of his life. So, that, again, this sort of tragic narrative is something that was part of Baldwin's life, because these were tragic times. But the source of his genius, sometimes I think there's a tendency, think of Billie Holiday, right? Everybody thinks the source of her genius, not everybody, but it's painted as it's coming through suffering alone. That's the source of her genius. Or drug addiction. Ray Charles the same. There's this tendency with black artists in particular to sort of buy into that stereotype, but I was trying to not tell, but kind of show how actually the source of his genius was actually love and his ability to connect with other people.
So I want to talk a bit about process. You talked about the FBI documents. Let me tell you, this is like exhaustive, meticulous, and so well woven into the narrative. His phone bills, okay, at one of the writing retreats, like, how'd you know how high his phone bills were? He spent a lot of money, a lot of time on the phone. His letters to Mary Painter, deep, as you said, but also things like, I'm up to my ass in manuscript. The FBI surveillance, which you point out their errors, documentary in Turkey, a tape that ABC, right, never shot. These intimate letters. Talk about just even the Schomburg, right, and talk about that. It's just so richly researched.
Especially the Schomburg. I mean, the collections there, for anyone who hasn't been, those are the most voluminous. There are several Baldwin archives throughout this country, but at the Schomburg, they're absolutely amazing. Stephen Fullwood put together this incredible finder's guide. So I didn't even get through all of them. They're so extraordinary. Process was. The FBI files, of course, were evil and horrible and terrible, but there was one good thing about them, is that they were excellent at tracking Baldwin's airplane flights. So, they were wrong about a lot of other things, but, Baldwin lived this crazy life. If you tried to map his life on a map with lines, it would be everything would be crossed out, because he was moving throughout Europe and Africa and the Middle East and then the US and all over the US, the southern United States. Had such an impact on him, especially his first trip there in 1957. So keeping track of everything was incredibly difficult. And I would go to these artist residencies that Baldwin went to. I went to Yaddo and MacDowell.
You traveled also.
Yes.
You followed his footsteps in many ways.
I went to Istanbul a couple times. I had to go to the south of France and Tuscany. I mean,
Suffering,
I did it, you guys.
suffering.
I did it for you. No. But I was very lucky to have all this fellowship support, including at the Schomburg, because these were difficult.
And those opened up only recently, right? To scholars.
2017 they were acquired. I think 2018 they were available. There are also Yaddo records at the main branch of the New York Public Library, and the Beinecke has incredible materials. But I went to Corsica, to the place where there's an interlude in the book where Baldwin goes to Corsica, and this is where he considers taking his life again. And so I went there. I took my mother, actually, but that's a whole other story.
Mother on the road.
and then the southern United States, he came back and went down there. But it really was a collage project, because I would go to these artist residencies that Baldwin had gone to, and all the writers would show up with their computers, and the artists would show up with these trucks full of canvases and paint and everything, and I would show up with my pickup truck full of archives and books, because I do all paper, nothing digital. So everyone thought I was a visual artist, and in fact, the way I was, because I would sometimes spend weeks not writing at all, just mapping Baldwin's life out on a canvas and moving things around and color coding it and figuring out which letters went where and where he was, and it could drive you absolutely insane, but it's what had to be done in order to track his complex movements.
One thing that I love that you do is that you write about him as a writer. Just his rituals, his frustrations, his writer's block.
Late nights.
Late nights, but also too, as a writer myself, just his enormous creativity and drive, I mean, into his latest years. You're nodding.
Yeah, I mean, his writing, he would basically stay up all night partying with his friends, and sometimes reading, often actually reading aloud to them, and then they would all go to sleep, and he would keep writing until he could hear the birds. And this wonderful thing about these letters is that he really describes the writing process. He's in Corsica, and he's got this cat or dog that's attached itself to him. Same thing in Istanbul. And that was that's a tough life to maintain. I mean, I have to say, I think, he was a drinker and a smoker, and I think that routine.
He physically kind of paid the price too.
He did, and that was also the stress of his life. I mean, it's really kind of earth-shattering to think what he did, what he accomplished as a writer, which was his first priority and calling, but when he was also on the front lines of the civil rights movement, and he was all, as you guys know, all over television, radio. He lived this kind of double.
And he had this family that he was being responsible for as well.
Yes, and he had a lot of drama in his love life. So, I mean, how do you pack this all into, I don't want to overstate things, but part of why I felt drawn to tell the full canvas of his life as much as possible is that I do think he lived maybe like the most remarkable 20th century life of any writer that I can personally think of, in terms of offering a window into so many important flashpoints and occurrences in America in that century.
We are in a moment now. We think about his long life and the hope that came with the civil rights movement, the violence that came afterwards. I wonder, a lot of it just feels so resonant in a very painful way right now. And I'm wondering what you think he offers us, now in a moment like this.
I mean, that's a tough one. We have excellent commentators like Eddie Glaude's Begin Again, who have turned to Baldwin to talk about our current moment. I feel uncomfortable prognosticating what he would say right now, in part because he had such an idiosyncratic mind, and also because he changed his mind a lot. And actually, that's one of the things that I would point to, is his willingness to change his mind is something that we can all...
He evolves.
He changed his mind about Palestine, for example. He changed his mind about gender, as we've discussed a little bit. And he changed his mind. I mean, he was very influenced by Malcolm X and moved sort of closer to his positions than Martin Luther King's, and really saw that the need for all kinds of different approaches after in the 70s and beyond, because he was not, as he would often say, like, how much time do you want for your progress? He saw that it wasn't happening. So I think we can look to his later work. He was also writing about AIDS in interesting ways late in his career, and the Reagan. He had stuff to say about Reagan and Michael Jackson. So I think instead of prognosticating what he would say, I would suggest going to his later works, like his introduction to The Price of the Ticket, his collected essays. He's really reflecting back on his early years with this kind of truth and clarity that weren't there before. Freaks in the American Ideal of Manhood, the same. So that would be my first suggestion, is like, let's go look at where Baldwin was in those later years, and how he was talking about the 80s, because a lot of those issues are still very much with us. The Evidence of Things Not Seen, which is a book that many people don't like, but he was really writing about kind of the saturation of the media cycle with images of black suffering that we now see with our phones, right? That teenagers are confronted with in really awful ways. So he was writing about our times already.
Yeah, and I also think that a thing that I feel like he offers me is that he just kept going. Like, in the face of, he was a best-selling author, and then at the end people just said, he has nothing more to say. And he kept going, he kept writing, and I feel like that says a lot in this moment, that we need to just keep doing what we do, which feels important. I have one last thought for you, Nick, because we're going to go into Q&A first. in a few minutes because we want to hear from, we've got some questions from the audience. We've talked a lot about this as a love story in so many ways, and it is one. Love stories of Baldwin's life, even love story between Baldwin and the written word. But I was thinking too that it is a love story of author and subject, you know, in so many ways. This is like you have spent so much of your life doing this, right? How does that feel to have this come out in the world in this way, in this moment?
People have asked that, like, oh, do you have this sense of emptiness or loss?
Joy.
Like, and I'm like, no, I don't. I am so happy it's done. I am so happy to share it with the world, and I'm so happy for, there are a lot of people writing about Baldwin now, which is terrific. And so there's more works to come by other writers and scholars and artists. There are a lot of visual artists who are inspired by Baldwin, who are producing works. So it's a moment that I think there's a whole sort of cohort of artists, writers, and scholars who are in conversation with each other and Baldwin's work. And this is my contribution, and now I'm done.
Okay, so some of you kindly gave us some questions that we're going to bring to Nick. This kind of touches on what we were just talking about, but was it intimidating to write a biography like this as a first in the past 30 years? And how did you feel about that?
I guess I sort of answered that, but yes, I mean, Baldwin's an immensely intimidating subject. I don't think I ever would have written a biography if it hadn't organically happened. I mean, I didn't.
Right, you didn't.
20 years ago, I wasn't like, in fact, quite the opposite. 20 years ago, Judith Thurman, who was the New Yorker writer, who was very good friends with the Cazac family when this was all happening, she said, oh, well, you have to write a James Baldwin biography. And I said, no way. Because it's just the sheer amount. I mean, first of all, there were excellent biographies
that had been written, right.
And secondly, just a sheer amount of information that we did not have until the Schomburg became available, until the Beinecke continued to acquire, would have made this project very impossible. But also, honestly, I didn't approach it or think of it as a biography until that term got put on it. I thought of it as more the subtitle, a love story, or love stories, and I thought of it as narrative nonfiction, if anything. Like, I really wanted to write it as a compelling narrative, first and foremost, not kind of a this happened, then that happened, then this happened, then that happened. So I would call myself a reluctant biographer. I think if I'd approached it thinking it was a biography, I don't think I ever would have been able to do it.
All right. You touched on this a bit. Did James Baldwin know Malcolm X? He did, obviously, yeah?
He knew and greatly admired Malcolm X, and they had a lot of overlap and a lot of differing opinions, but one of the many interesting things about their relationship, but when Baldwin was on the March on Washington, he was not allowed to speak. And there are several reasons for this, people speculate about, because of his homosexuality, but what Malcolm said, which was interesting, he said they didn't want him up there because they didn't know what he would say. They couldn't control him. And he had actually just come back from Paris, composing a letter representing African Americans abroad who were supporting the March on Washington. And he was supposed to read from this, but they didn't want him up there. So, and it was sort of more about black liberation globally. And this was also not consonant with what the more kind of mainstream civil rights figures were trying to do. But the weirdest thing, I mean, even weirder than the Charlton Heston, I think, is what happened with that speech, because without attributing it to Baldwin, making it sound as if he was in fact reading it, you can find this on YouTube, that his speech was read by Burt Lancaster. And that's just one of the strangest moments in civil rights history, in my opinion. I mean, but Baldwin and Malcolm X was like, that's crazy, and also, of course they're not gonna let him speak, because he would have said, those words about global black liberation coming out of his mouth would have registered very differently to that crowd and on that day. And so in a sense, I think there was a lot of mutual respect between them. And I think that's part of why Baldwin so badly wanted to write and did try to write that screenplay that eventually became sort of the inspiration for Spike Lee's film. So that was a positive outcome. But Baldwin desperately wanted I'm on a tangent now, but Baldwin desperately
No,
wanted
it's still
success
related.
in film. He wanted to, he really wanted all his novels to be turned into films. He craved it. So it's great to see, Raoul Peck's documentary. It's great to see If Beale Street Could Talk, Barry Jenkins, because Baldwin really, really wanted that kind of impact. Baldwin wanted to be a best-selling writer, and Baldwin wanted to reach as many people as possible. He understood the power of images in cinema. He also critiqued
theater
them.
as well.
In theater as well. He also critiqued the racism of Hollywood films in The Devil Finds Work. And he wrote about, he did not write about Malcolm X in that book, so I don't know how I came full circle to that, but.
That's okay. Another question about
Actually, no, he did write about Malcolm X in that book. He wrote about his time out there trying to make the screenplay.
Okay. A question about the archives. It touches on something you've spoken about before. Where did you do your archival research? You've talked a bit about that, but can you talk about the best find, the most astonishing? I'm sure there are many, but there's one maybe that you just thought.
I'm going to tell two really quickly because my mother will kill me if I don't tell the one about her. But the first, so I'll tell that one.
And talk about Mom. You've got to do that.
I went to Corsica, and no one had been there, I don't think, a Baldwin scholar, and found the house where he was, and where he had, after a bad breakup, had sort of jumped over a terrace with some brandy and down a wall and gone down to the water and contemplated suicide. And then he had an epiphany, and he came back and went to the American South. So this was sort of a pivotal moment. So I got a fellowship, the Bob Caro Fellowship. Bob Caro wrote a book called Working about how biographers have to turn every page and go every place. And so I took my mother with me, and she found the house, and we knocked on the door, and no one answered. It was a hot summer, so we started walking down to the water. At least we could see that part of the story. And we looked back at the terrace that Baldwin had jumped down from, and there was a woman doing laundry. So I jumped behind a tree, but my mother goes, "Bonjour, madame," and up we go into the house that is virtually unchanged since Baldwin was there in 1957. And so I told Bob Caro later, there's another rule for biographers, which is always bring your mother. So that's story one. And story two is Beatrice Cazac, the wife of Yoran Cazac, a wonderful, extraordinary woman. I met her in 2003. Her husband died in 2005. And then I went back to Tuscany in 2018, so years later, to see her and to see if she had any more documents pertaining to their relationship. And she strews them out on her bed, all these documents, and she finds a 7-page unpublished love poem that Baldwin had written to her husband that she hadn't seen in 45 years. There was this rusty metal paperclip on it, and it was written in French because Yoran didn't speak English. It was called Saturnia, which was a hot spring they'd gone to together. And Baldwin had gone back to St. Paul de Vence, and Yoran had gone back to Tuscany. And it's this beautiful, she stood there translating it for me, all 7 pages, as the sun set over the Tuscan hills. It was a remarkable moment, and it was this beautiful love poem about how much he misses him and how he wakes up and thinks of him, and he wonders if he's eaten yet, and he wonders if he's shaved. He reads his horoscope, and his horoscope. I mean, things that we've all probably done. So it's had this universal element to it, but also kind of really, it also provided what I've been looking for actually for 20 years, which was a real sense of the texture and reality of their relationship.
Oh, and that's what a wonderful way to wrap up. Thank you. It's the last question.